Cajun or Creole, traditional or not, all that matters is that this tastes amazing and you need to try it. Growing up in New Orleans, I was inevitably exposed to all the Cajun classics when it comes to food, all the deeply flavored, rich, and spicy dishes that just remind you of home cooking. And as picky as I was for most of my life, I was never opposed to a good bowl of gumbo. Gumbo is cultural fusion done to perfection, with influences stemming from France and Spain, as well as Africa and even Native America, and the city of New Orleans rests on its roots. It's essentially a soup-like dish with an incredibly rich and roasty flavored broth, and it's usually enhanced by meat or seafood or both. Today we're going to make the classic Cajun chicken and sausage gumbo. I'm not an expert on Cajun food even though I live here. I don't have many local recipes on my channel, but I figured it would be a good idea to show my take on this local classic. I think I have some cool tips to make this taste unique and really good, and at the very least, I hope I can make at least one new person try this dish. You're going to need some time and patience to make this dish, so just sit back and let me take you through this. Now I'm going to start off by prepping all of my ingredients, and if you're unfamiliar with Cajun cooking, we use what is called the Trinity, which is quite similar to the French mirepoix, but we swap out the carrots for bell peppers. And then you also have your onion and then your celery. And garlic is almost always tacked on as a fourth element. So I've got 2 medium-sized yellow onions, 3 stalks of celery, 2 bell peppers, I have 1 red and 1 green for color contrast, and then about 8 cloves of garlic. I just take a few moments to dice all these up. They don't have to be a super fine dice, but they probably shouldn't be as big as I cut them here. I don't really know what I was doing. They're going to melt down in the gumbo, so they'll be super soft anyway, but they're still going to somewhat maintain their size. Now one thing I always do is I save the scraps of the vegetables. So that's the roots and stem of the onion and bell pepper, and the tops and bottoms of the celery stalks. We're going to use those in just a minute. I'm combining my Trinity into a large bowl because we're going to use that at the same time, and I just keep my garlic in a separate bowl because that comes later. And since I have my cutting board out, I'm also going to slice up my sausage. Now in my humble opinion, gumbo isn't gumbo without andouille sausage. This is a French style double smoked sausage that just has a unique flavor. To me, it's just the epitome of Cajun cooking. That being said, it is pretty hard to find outside of Louisiana, so if you can't find this, I wouldn't let it stop you from making a gumbo. You can just use kielbasa or another type of smoked sausage. I'm just slicing mine on a slight bias because it makes it look a little prettier, and I'm using like 36 ounces or 2 kilograms or a little over 2 pounds. And just set that aside and we'll get back to it in a minute. And for the chicken part of the chicken and sausage, I'm going to use 2 rotisserie chickens. You could definitely make this yourself, but this is one less step that you'll have to do among everything else. Plus, these are pretty cheap, fully cooked from places like Sam's or Costco. While it's still fairly warm, I'm going to use 2 gloves and shred apart the meat from both chickens. I did this a day in advance just to have one less thing to do on cooking day, but it's best to shred this while it's still warm, so that's why I'm doing it now. Now you want to save the bones and all the loose ends from both chickens, including the juice that collects at the bottom of the container, because these can still greatly enhance our gumbo, so we'll talk about that in a second. Now to me, the 2 most important things when making a gumbo are properly making the roux, which we're going to get to in a minute, and having a well-flavored stock. Obviously the best way to have a good stock is to make everything from scratch, but I even understand why that isn't always feasible or ideal. However, store-bought stock often lacks in the flavor department, and it can end up being more salty than actually tasting like something. So we're going to find a middle ground that still allows us to make this full dish in a matter of a few hours. I take a lot of inspiration for this from the Cajun Ninja. He does something very similar with his stock, but I'm going to do a few things differently. So I'm taking a gallon or nearly 4 liters of store-bought chicken stock, which I'm using mostly these containers of chicken stock, but I'm also going to supplement with a little chicken bouillon and water. I just think that brings a little more authentic flavor, but use whatever combination you like, just have roughly a gallon. Now I'm going to take some unflavored gelatin powder and dump about 3 packets or 21 grams in. This stuff is really a hack for making any kind of homemade soup or stew. It's going to make our store-bought stock resemble a homemade stock much more closely, at least texturally. It just thickens it up, which is going to make the mouth feel much better and allow the flavors to coat your mouth much better. You don't want to add too much though, because gumbo is not a stew and you don't want it to be too thick. Let that sit cold for a few minutes to let the gelatin dissolve and work its magic. Then into a stock pot, I'm going to add those chicken trimmings and bones, as well as the scraps of vegetables, and then I'll pour in all my gelatinized stock. Now would be a good time to check your veggie drawer and see if there's anything about to go bad. I threw in a bunch of Italian parsley that I wasn't going to use for anything else, just anything to enhance the flavor of your stock even more. I'm just going to warm that on a low simmer and just keep it there until I need it. These small extra steps are going to do a lot for our final product. Gumbo relies heavily on whatever stock you put in to flavor it, so this is going to make a pretty big difference, especially as leftovers. You'll see that once you refrigerate it, it'll really thicken up and get that gelatinous, jiggly texture that we all love. That's how you know it's going to be good. Anyway, in the meantime, I'm going to sear my sausage, which you can do this when other things are happening, like when you're making your roux, but I'm just showing you things one step at a time. I've got a couple pans going over medium-high heat, and I'll sear my sausage in batches. All we're aiming to do is get a brown coating on all the outside of each slice of sausage. You don't need any extra oil because these have a lot of fat inside of them that's going to render out, so just stir them around for a few minutes until you have a nice sear. Repeat with the rest of the sausage, and once you're done you should have a fond on the bottom. Hopefully you were careful enough to not burn it because this can add more flavor to our gumbo. I'm going to add part of the water, which I'm adding anyway later, to the hot pan and scraping up all those flavor bits, and then you can dump this directly into your stock pot to add more flavor to it. For reference, I added another quart or liter of water to my stock, but you can play with your ratios, this is just what I like. Okay, now it's time to make the roux. You may have seen roux in other types of cooking like making gravies or cheese sauces. All it is just flour and a fat that you mix together to thicken up whatever sauce that you're making with it. But what's special about a gumbo roux is that it's an extra dark roux, meaning that you take this to the brink of burning because you want to impart those extra roasty flour flavors into your gumbo, which gives it its signature flavor. So I'm adding a cup or 225 milliliters of neutral oil, I'm using canola oil, and 1 cup or 120 grams of all-purpose flour. You need a flat wooden spoon like this because it's going to make everything so much easier. I'll link this below. First, just mix everything together until you have all your flour dissolved into the oil, and then there's more than one way to do this, but I suggest if this is your first time going low and slow, because once it gets brown it's very easy to burn a roux. Some people talk about making this in 5 to 10 minutes, but to me that's just too dangerous. That said, I do start on a pretty high heat at the beginning because that's when the roux is least susceptible to burning. You just need to constantly stir this and never stop the entire time, because you need to lift all the flour on the bottom back to the top and keep repeating that so none of the stuff on the bottom burns. So here's my roux after about 15 minutes of stirring on medium-high heat. It's already pretty dark, but we have a long way to go. You have different shades of blonde to peanut butter to caramel to brown to dark chocolate. But at this point I'm going to start lowering it to medium or medium-low heat because the darker it gets, the closer it gets to burning. And here it is again after about 45 minutes. You can see it's a little bit darker, but it's not changing too much. But believe me, you're getting closer and closer. I ended up taking this all the way to an hour and a half. You could probably stop a little sooner, but the closer you get to burning without actually burning, the better the flavor is going to be. For reference, here it is at the 3 different time intervals that I just went over. You just don't want to stop too early because I've done that before and it leaves a pretty bland gumbo. But the more times you do it, the more comfortable you get, and I'm speaking from personal experience. I just say give yourself a lot of time to make this dish, and then you won't have to worry about rushing anything, and you'll have a really good gumbo to show for it. But now it's time to get things rolling. I'm going to take my vegetable trinity and add it into my hot roux. And just be careful not to splatter yourself, but do stir this quickly. The vegetables can burn just as easily as the roux can, so keep them moving. These will quickly soften up and start to release their flavor. You can increase the heat here because these have a lot of water that they're going to release as well. But just stir these constantly for about 15 minutes I'd say. And with maybe about 5 minutes left is when I'm going to add my garlic. Just don't want to risk that burning. Okay, this might be a little controversial, but I like to add a few tablespoons of tomato paste at this point. I know a lot of people are adamant about having no tomatoes in Cajun gumbo, but I don't consider tomato paste to be a tomato ingredient. I just like to use it whenever I have any kind of fond that I'm going to deglaze because it boosts the umami flavor and it definitely deepens the flavor of any kind of stock or soup. But you don't have to do it if you don't want to. By the way, at some point towards the end of your roux making process, we're going to strain out our stock. So at first, I'm pouring it into a colander over my largest bowl in the sink, and then as you can see, that didn't catch everything. There's still little bits of stuff in my stock, so I'll carefully pour it back into my stock pot over a mesh sieve. And you can go even further and use a skimmer to catch anything else that you see on top. But we are going to need this stock now to deglaze our vegetables and roux, so just take a few ladlefuls and dump them in. I wouldn't want to pour the whole stock pot into this, even if my pot was large enough, so it's best to temper this mixture, which means bringing both of these pots to around the same temperature. That's going to reduce the risk of your emulsions breaking and your roux coagulating. So after a few rounds of dumping ladlefuls of stock in, you should have this pasty mixture like this.
He means pasty as in texture, not like his skin color.
Rude. But if your pot is big enough, you can dump your stock all into it now. But since my stock pot is bigger, I'm going to dump all my veggies into that. Now stir this generously to try to disperse all the roux and vegetables into the stock, but they should naturally meld together over time as you simmer. Okay, now I'm going to preemptively add some seasonings. I'm doing about 1.5 tablespoons of Cajun or Creole seasoning. I use Tony's, it's my favorite, and you should be able to find it in most places, at least in the States. And then I'm also adding like 1 tablespoon of dried thyme leaves and another tablespoon of dried oregano. Also about 1 teaspoon of garlic powder and like 3 to 4 dried bay leaves. I'm going to save the salt and pepper until I'm done simmering because I want those to be more precise. So at this point I'm going to cover and simmer on low for like 2 hours. At this point, you can clean up and start to get things ready for your guests. Maybe start your rice cooking. And at the 2-hour mark, I'm going to add back in my meats, which at this point are kind of chilled. I'm going to put in my sausage and chicken to let them warm back up. I didn't want them to simmer the whole time with the stock because they can dry out and overcook. But give those at least like 15 minutes to heat through. And at this point, you can taste for final seasonings. I usually add a bit more salt and some black pepper. And here's some more controversy, but I'm gonna add a couple tablespoons of fish sauce. I don't know anyone that puts this in their gumbo, and I understand why, but I just had this thought because this is really good to add to soups and stuff like this. When it's used right, it does not taste like fish in the slightest. It just adds an umami boost, and it deepens the flavor of any kind of soup that you're making. And I think it makes a difference. I noticed it before and after tasting. So as long as you don't overdo it, I think you can enhance the flavor of your gumbo with this. But again, don't do this if you don't want to. So you can remove the bay leaves at this point and just stir everything around. It wouldn't hurt to simmer this more, just keep it on low heat, and it'll last just fine before your guests arrive. I ended up driving this an hour and a half to some friend's house for a church gathering. It came out great, but the amounts that I list here make enough for about 15 really generous servings. I made a little bit more and I fed about 20 people with it and still had leftovers, which leftovers are like the best part of gumbo, so always make extra. It freezes really well too. But speaking of leftovers, I did do a taste test on the next day. I just made some fresh rice and then scooped this all around to make it look good for the thumbnail. But you can top your gumbo however you'd like with more black pepper. A lot of people use hot sauce, and my favorite is Louisiana hot sauce. By the way, if you want more spicy gumbo, you can add more cayenne pepper when you season it, but when I make it for a lot of people, I don't add any extra, just to be on the safe side. Okay, I also do some green onions on top of the rice, and then a lot of people use gumbo filé powder, which I don't have because I don't really like it on my gumbo. But it's traditional, it's ground sassafras leaves, so it leaves a little earthy flavor on your gumbo. But like I said, you do you. I hope this kind of comprehensive guide to gumbo inspires you to make it at some point. If I could share one thing from my city and my culture, this would be it. So I hope you enjoyed. If you do make this, let me know, and let me know if you have any questions or concerns. But I'm gonna wrap up with a taste test. Let's get to it. Okay, I'm stoked. But spoiler alert, I already had this last night and it was amazing. However, gumbo is always better the next day anyway as leftovers. Like I said, I'm not a prolific Cajun cook at all, even though I grew up in New Orleans. I mean, I'm not a prolific cook at all, but specifically not Cajun cooking, definitely. But I still think trying the many gumbos that I've tried in my lifetime and experimenting with recipes that I've done before, I still think this is a very great option. But enough piddle paddling, let's try this on camera. Oh yeah. Yes. This is always best when it's borderline mouth scalding hot. This kind of cooled off with all the pictures I had to take, but man, that's still an amazing gumbo. What's crazy is you can get most everything for this recipe almost anywhere in the world. The hardest thing to get is the andouille sausage, which is a huge part of this gumbo in my opinion. But still, even if you use a different kind of smoked sausage, you're still gonna get something that tastes really good. And if you've never really tried Cajun cooking, this is definitely the gateway that I would recommend you try. I love soups and stuff from different cultures. We just did a Korean soup a few weeks ago, but I really can't deny the nostalgia of a heartwarming gumbo. This just makes you feel good. I'm never gonna go back to not putting gelatin in this. That makes all the difference in my opinion. It allows you to experience all the different flavors on a deeper level. And as long as you brown your roux to the brink of burning without burning it, you're gonna end up with something amazing. But that's it. If you're from here as well, let me know what your family does differently for their gumbo recipe. You know, everyone has their own different things that they do. I don't always urge people to try my recipes, but this is definitely one that I would try if you ever have the chance. I promise you won't regret it. Thank you guys for watching, be blessed, and I'll see y'all next time. Yes. Now my ancestors finally have something to be proud of.